Hello, it's Emma Thayer and Tom Breeze here, again from the Clinical Practice Workstream. And once again, we are modelling some conversations, professional dialogues that might take place centring on assessment of student teachers on clinical practice. These are the sorts of professional conversations that we hope will take place between students and mentors, students and senior mentors, mentors and university tutors, discussing the students' progress either in the run-up to or indeed the conducting of the progress reviews.
So what we're doing here is taking one of the professional teaching standards, namely pedagogy number 2, differentiation, and taking a dive into the sort of conversations that would take place when trying to come to a judgment about progress in this area. Hopefully what we say here will be easily applicable to other standards in the professional teaching standards, or if you're thinking a little bit more holistically, then you could apply this when considering groups of standards. The key thing to look for here is the Assessment of Student Teachers on Clinical Practice Guide, which is available in the Cardiff Partnership area of Moodle. In that book is a really helpful table of the sort of language you would be using when discussing students at particular levels. And that language is really handy for really crystallising your thinking about where people are. And therefore, it's good practice to try and use that language at every opportunity when giving written feedback in the formative comment books or on learning and teaching observation forms.
And the final thing to say is that this guidance is not intended to be phase or subject specific, but hopefully applicable across and to all of our student teachers on all of our programmes at Cardiff Met.
So the student teacher we're looking at here, student C, is at the capable stage. So if we take a look on the table, we can see the sort of language that we're talking about here when we're discussing a student at the capable stage. Notice the word mainly in brackets quite a lot of the time. We're not asking for kind of flawless performance, but what we are looking for is that things are becoming established and embedded, that they're having an impact, things are being done consistently, and that there's an increasing level of independence from the mentor.
And it's worth mentioning again that we are looking at the differentiation standard, and we're assessing the student teacher on their ability to demonstrate knowledge, understanding and experience of high expectations and effective practice in meeting the needs of all learners, whatever their different needs. So starting with the evidence in the student teacher's plans, what we can see here is that the student teacher is drawing upon generic whole school data for individual pupils, but they're also synthesising multiple sources of data, both subject specific and slightly more generic. But what they're doing as well is that the insights that they are making into the individual learners that they've come to know during the course of Clinical Practice 1 or 2 has started to add a much more complex picture of the pupils' needs in this particular class. What they've also done is they've also had the opportunity to assess, even if informally, pupils in this particular class, and they have also added into that top box any other useful insights based on pupil progress that are going to be useful to the remaining sequence of learning.
And this is a theme that's going to come up throughout this discussion, that in moving from the aware to the capable stage, a student teacher needs to make a significant investment of time into what they're doing. And so a really good list of class information and data that's going to be rich and relevant is not going to appear in the top of that lesson plan overnight. The student teacher is going to be adding things based on insights that they've got. They're going to be feeding in new kinds of data and information. They're going to understand that this information here is not static, even though it does sit over the top of a stream of lessons. And the result of having that understanding is that when we move down into individual lessons that we look at in the plans, we see consistently that the strategies for differentiation that the student teacher is choosing are well chosen for specific individual pupils and groups. It's clear that the student teacher really knows the individual pupils in this class and that they fully intend to challenge all of them. They're not just going to stretch the more able and talented, they're going to stretch the more able, they're going to stretch the ones in the middle, and that where they're putting support and scaffolding in place to help pupils, they're aiming to take it away progressively where appropriate, so that the pupil is not dependent on them for all time.
And I guess what we're noticing here as well is that whilst we're looking at P2 here, we're also getting a sense that this particular student teacher is starting to understand the links between assessing their pupils and then being able to tailor their differentiation accordingly. So the interconnectedness of standards is tacitly in evidence here in this student teacher's planning. They may, and we notice the jump from aware to capable here, have created new differentiation strategies that they have independently developed based on their increasing knowledge of the pupils, and they won't entirely be relying on strategies or approaches that have been given to them by the mentor. And this is borne out again also and triangulated by the judgments that the mentor makes later on. What they've also done consistently is they've been considering any TAs, any teaching assistants that have been assigned to their classes, and it's clear that the student has planned strategically for the input that the TA makes with the learners to which they've been assigned. They've also uploaded, and this is kind of crucial at this capable stage, if we think about the descriptor of capable as mainly impactful, this student teacher has also uploaded and tagged multiple evidence of pupil progress to demonstrate the impact of differentiation strategies employed. Of particular note is a before and after shot of a pupil's bookwork by a learner who was assigned a TA. So again, we've got that triangulation of the strategies employed and planned for in the plans, the feedback from the mentor, and then the evidence coming through in pupil work.
Let's move on to the evidence that the student teachers got in terms of research and inquiry. And we're going to continue the theme here that if we're going to be considered capable, we have to see a deep and rich seam of evidence from multiple sources. This is not a kind of one-hit problem-solved approach. And so what we should see in the student teachers' research and inquiry evidence is that they've looked at a wide range of sources that can help them understand differentiation. Here's an example of one of the research and inquiry log entries that the student has done, and we can see that they've got literature in here, Tom Sherrington's Rosenshine's Principles in Action, which is a very accessible piece of work, very current and topical, but a great piece of work to look at, full of good practical ideas. The student teacher has also gone further, realised that Sherrington's worth a look and that he's got a blog, and has started looking at some of his other writing on his blog to add extra information above and beyond what there is in the book. There are a huge number of things that the student could be looking at in terms of writing, not just high-level research findings from big journals, but practitioner texts, absolutely fine. Some texts about differentiation may be very generic, talking about it in the round. Some might be looking at differentiation really specifically to do with the subject that the student is teaching or the phase that they're at or what they're particularly looking at. They could be having conversations with experienced teachers. They could be collaborating with student teachers. They may have an assignment that they've done which includes some aspect of differentiation. But what we're looking for here is that there's multiple sources, there's a rich range of evidence, and that the student is taking a progressive, independent and cyclic approach to this reflection in which they don't see the job as being done when they've reflected once, but that they continually feed in more and more information. They sit down and they do the thinking to make this new information impact on their practice, and they're becoming self-improving and increasingly independent.
Agreed. And it's really interesting to see in relation to that very specific example from this particular student's portfolio of evidence, the log, research and inquiry log entry, which mentions Sherrington's Rosenshine's Principles, where they're trying to get to understand an incident that took place in relation to a lesson pertaining to differentiation. So when we move to look at the evidence in the lesson, so coming through in the assessment of this student teacher, we notice that they did have an observation, an informal observation that was captured in the Blue Book, where some issues in the application of the almost sum approach to differentiating learning outcomes was having a negative impact on the engagement and on the progress of pupils in that particular lesson. And this student, being capable, picked up on that and saw that as an opportunity to take a deep dive into what happened using the Baines reflective model, You could argue one of the more challenging of the reflective models that we've got from our selection of 4, and using that to really try and understand, to problem solve, to reflect and develop their understanding of what happened in that particular lesson. We then see later on in future feedback that they receive that they have made adjustments to their practice. Tom mentioned earlier on this particular student's learning and teaching plans and the level of challenge that they're providing for all learners. So we can see that cyclic approach to progression and to developing their practice that Tom mentioned coming through in that kind of joined up interconnectedness between the evidence that this student has tagged in relation to this standard.
So remember the words mainly impactful in the table of language when considering what actually goes on in lessons, because all of these other activities that the student teacher's doing, the research and inquiry activities, the planning, whatever it may be, we need to see impact on their teaching practice from these things, and we need to see a progressive evolutionary improvement in what the student teacher is doing. Another mention really of this theme that moving from unaware to aware is a relatively small step, but moving from aware to capable is quite a long road in which the student teacher needs to prove themselves consistently over a period of time. So when the student teacher is actually teaching, we should see this progressive improvement. We should see the student teacher really knowing the pupils as individuals, understanding what they need, and having a wide variety of strategies available in their pocket so that they can meet those needs in the lesson. We should see them understanding as well that you have the more able and you have the less able who might be very visible and very obvious for whatever reason. But we also have these pupils who are able but not very visible, perhaps the ones that are happy to coast, and maybe the ones who are struggling but don't make a big deal of it, like to hide under the radar a little bit, and that the student has got strategies that mean that they actively spot and challenge these pupils, and that we can see this from the evidence. Again, this almost some approach has clearly caused this student teacher a problem. It's caused them to stop and think, and hopefully what they've done in terms of the research and inquiry there means that they're really beginning to understand the enormous range of personalities that they have in the classroom in front of them.
And I just wanted to pick up on that point that you made, Tom, about this jump from aware to capable. And I think there's a wider implication for mentors, senior mentors and university tutors working with the student teacher to support them in being able to make those connections and join up their thinking, and perhaps even prescribe some research and inquiry activity, which might lead to some research and inquiry log entries that allow them to problem solve and elaborate on the reflective thought process that they're going through.
So what we should be seeing at this stage, don't forget, with a capable student is a student who's able to be signed off with qualified teacher status, who's able to become independent of the mentor and move away and start working on their own in their own classroom. So this student teacher is going to be able to adapt their planned strategies confidently in light of what actually happens in the lesson. They can change the plan on the fly because they're confident enough in what they're doing and what they know to do that. They would also be evolving over time in terms of their approach to the strategies. So they're not just going to keep using the same strategies with the same pupils. They're going to see the pupils as evolving and the strategies as changing as well. The aim is always to reduce that scaffolding, to reduce that support, and allow the pupils to fly free of the teacher in the same way as the student teacher is hoping eventually to fly free of the mentor. So we're seeing a cyclic approach by the student teacher in terms of seeking information and advice, devising the strategies, evolving what they're doing. The mentor needs to be confident that the student teacher would be able to do this by themselves with a full new set of classes in a new school, in a new context, before they can consider that that student teacher is capable and therefore worthy of receiving qualified teacher status.
So once we've established via the evidence that this particular student is capable, we then need to start to think about prescribing some targets to move them forward to QTS Plus. And this is again where the language of these key milestones in the student teacher's progression is really useful. So when we look to QTS Plus, we see words like firmly established, extensive, consistent, fully embedded, in depth, high quality, and intuitive. So when we think about next steps in relation to P2 differentiation, we're looking at broadening the opportunities and experience of this student to utilise this effective practice in differentiation with multiple classes, with multiple pupils, in multiple contexts, perhaps looking at slightly more challenging content. So when all of those variations are modified or are changed, can the student teacher still demonstrate that extensive, consistent practice in relation to differentiation? Also, there's an opportunity in relation to research and innovation. Could this student be signposted to consortia so that they could perhaps share some of their findings and the impact that they've been having within the realms of differentiation on some kind of platform, for example, a consortia's publication or blog? Is there any way that they could be given the opportunity to share some of the progress that they've witnessed with their learners and facilitated with their department or on a broader school level, or to feed into the school's development plan, or indeed beyond to the wider kind of cluster of schools? It also might be an opportunity to get them to look and see if they could perhaps develop this in relation to their master's level work. If they haven't done assignment 1, perhaps, then maybe this is a focus for them. If they're thinking about going on to do more master's level credits, this might be the sort of thing that could lead on to a dissertation. And finally, where is the potential opportunity for them to extend their skills in the enrichment weeks if they're at that stage, or if indeed it is something that they have really, really taken hold of and can see being an aspect of their practice that they hone later on down the line?
So that's a student teacher who is at the capable stage. So their work is firmly embedded, consistent, and they're independent and self-improving. And just a taste there of the idea of QTS Plus as really being a door opening, really, and the student teacher being allowed to fly off and look beyond the context of the narrow walls of their classroom to maybe look at influencing the school or the wider community or fellow student teachers, for other people to be able to learn from them. The sky's the limit, really, with QTS Plus. Hopefully this has helped to focus your mind about where you might be or where your student teacher might be, and give some suggestions for how to move them even further on their journey.